Shelmaya. This is a member of cabinet from 586. His personal effect from 586 found on site in what we strongly suspected is the administrative center of the Davidian dynasty. And I want to emphasize, because this is such a big deal, a personal effect of an individual person mentioned by full name and title from 586 before Christ, found exactly where the Bible said such a person will reside. I freaked out over this when I studied this in college. And this is not the only one of its kind that was discovered. And in February 2017, if memory serves, something that may actually be the personal property or personal signature stamp of Prophet Isaiah may have been found by Eilat Mazar. It's still not conclusive. Let's continue. Wonderful. It's my hand here holding the 5 shekel coin. And notice the capital head is an exact replica. The original is in the Israel Museum, Jerusalem, which is something we should all probably also go and visit when we're in Israel. And this is an original capital head, which would have existed in the palace of King David, the same palace that the story of Bathsheba would have happened on the rooftop of this palace. Let's continue. And the story of Bathsheba, by the way, is also 100% true. Let's continue. Guys, the various chambers underneath the royal residency is where the members of cabinet, the ministers, would reside. And they had a guy who was the minister of oil. This guy will be the equivalent of the Secretary of Energy in the United States government. They have the Minister of Horse. This guy is the equivalent of the Secretary of Transportation, etc. Let's continue. This is really cool. Ophir, let's go to the, okay, here we are. Guys, when I do bar mitzvah tours, after the whole 10-dayer is over, I ask the bar mitzvah boy, so what do you remember from your time here in the Holy Land? And they will always say the 3,000-year-old potty. And this is a 3,000-year-old potty. This is the oldest potty I can show you in the Holy Land, although I can show you several potties from antiquity. This one happens to be the oldest. There is no running water in the Holy Land anywhere prior to the year 332 before Christ, Alexander the Great, which means the dignitary went into the privy and did what he did, and someone that was less dignified from the dignitary had to go in there and clean after the dignitary. But let's analyze what this means. It means these guys have an indoor facility 3,000 years ago. What does this suggest to the level of society of the people that reside in such condition 3,000 years ago? Obviously, this is royalty and their inner circle. Let's continue. Another inscription in Proto-Hebrew, and I'm holding the 1 shekel coin because the Israeli 1 shekel coin says shekel in Proto-Hebrew. In this case, the inscription reads Yahu, which is a classic Hebraic name. Yirmiyahu, Chizkiyahu, Tzidkiyahu, etc. And this is Yahu, which is to the house, which means this individual was the butler for the palace at some time in the Old Testament period. This is his tomb. why is this entombment really, really interesting and really important to me? Because many a time when I read the Old Testament, I read, and such passed away, and he was gathered to his ancestors, and he slept with his forefathers. He was gathered to his people, and the description can change a little bit, and the translations also change a little bit. But I want you to understand something very, very clear as well. When we talk about such and such died and such was gathered to his ancestors, it means the person is deceased. Each one of the aristocratic families owns this mausoleum cave. The person is laid in that cave. When a year passes, the family members physically go to the cave. They physically collect the bones of their deceased relative and loved one with their hands, with their fingers. They gather the bones physically, and they physically put them in a communal shaft, which exists in the center of the cave, and the bones of his ancestors are waiting for the person over there. The Bible is describing a physical thing which is physically happening in the Old Testament period. Let's continue. This is how it looks like today. You can see that the cemetery from the time of King David, 1000 BC, and his lineage all the way to 586 BC is underneath a Muslim neighborhood. You can also see on the left-hand side of the imagery the cemetery, which is the Mountain of Olives today. Guys, this is going to be a little heavy duty, okay? But bear with me, especially if you're clergy. The Hebrews in the Old Testament don't believe in an afterlife. The Bible doesn't address the issue of what happens to a person or his soul after he dies anywhere in the Old Testament. It simply doesn't exist. I submit to you that this early Hebrew civilization rejects the notion of the afterlife because of how much the parent civilization, being the Egyptian civilization, obsesses over the afterlife. I myself, when I was a teenager, and every person has to do it, and I guess my girls will do it to me one day, must reject his parents' entire belief system to create his own separate persona, which is completely and utterly individualistic to his parents. Why am I mentioning this in the city of David? Because there's this story in the Bible, I know 100% it's true, the story of David screwing up and taking another man's wife, Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. The whole notion of our Bible, the Judeo-Christian Bible, our 10 Commandments given at Mount Sinai, means that a ruler cannot be an absolute ruler. A ruler is not a living God. The Pharaoh of Egypt is a physical embodiment of their chief deity, Ra, which the Hebrew word for evil or bad is Ra, until this very day. I want to also point out Jezebel, who was a foreign queen, she simply couldn't understand why Ahab can't take a man's field if he desires it. Much later in Kings. King David and this story, which I'm 100% sure it's true, it's in the Bible for all time, because it was such a shock that David did such a thing, and it violated the spirit of the Ten Commandments in the Torah in such a way, it had to go into the Bible for all time, that this thing will never be forgotten. And David is the only ruler in the entire world in this time frame that can't do such a thing. He can't just take something which belongs to another person. It means King David has a job description. He has to protect his people in wartime, and he has to mind the economy and create jobs and prosperity in peacetime. And he's the only ruler on the face of the planet which has to abide by the divine law, rather than make up whatever he wants as he goes along. Mesopotamia, Egypt, Phoenicia, and all other civilizations in this pretty horrible late Bronze Age, early Iron Age reality. I visited America a couple months ago before this COVID virus, and I went to see my sister in Boston, and I paid $30, and I went to see the reenactment of the Boston Tea Party at the Rave of Boston. And the actors are reenacting the address Samuel Adams gave the people of Boston right before the Tea Party of 1774. And I'm listening to the man's address. I'm saying, this guy is Old Testament preaching. He's rejecting absolute power at the hands of the ruler. I'm a Jewish biblical archaeologist from Israel. If I cannot recognize Old Testament content, we obviously have a really big problem. And if you ever wondered why Americans and Jews get along so notoriously well for one another for such a long time, it's because we have very similar worldview in our subconscious. Notice to the left is the cemetery that we have today, with each person getting his own individual burial. And let's talk about these differences in the next slide, because we talked a lot and pretty heavy and hardcore in this one. So let's change the slide. Let's look at the caves. They're perfectly square man-made cave with 2 or more stone benches or beds for the bodies to decompose on, and a communal shaft in the center. After the death of a person, and adding to the communal shaft and the pile of bones of the ancestors in it, the stone bench is now vacant, and it's awaiting the next deceased family member, and the whole cycle can go on forever, technically, until Nebuchadnezzar raided the city, destroyed it, stole the Ark of the Covenant, and its current whereabouts is the intellectual property of one Lucas and Spielberg. The difference is Ezekiel replaces Jeremiah as the primary prophet. And Ezekiel prophesies in Babylon. He's not even in Jerusalem. And in Ezekiel 37, he talks about the vision of the dry bones that one can attribute to the final trumpet and the physical resurrection of the dead. But let's look at that with the geopolitics of the time that it was given, and the fact that prophets are notoriously poetic people. And the vision of dry bones, and we can see it in Ezekiel 37, I'll just speak it in plain English, is, and they saw a valley filled with dry bones, baking in a desert sun. A powerful wind came from God, and the bones got joined together, joint for joint and limb for limb. and regrew their flesh and their skin, and lined up and went to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem to be judged in the end of days. Ophir just refers us to the slide, to the previous slide for 1 second, please. Guys, the cemetery that we have there on the Mount of Olives is the direct result of that prophecy in Ezekiel. They're literally being buried right over there, waiting for the fulfillment of this prophecy of Ezekiel 37. Knowing how metaphorical prophets are, one can also say that Ezekiel, when he's doing what he's doing in 550, roughly in the prime of the Babylonian exile, where there's no return of Zion to be envisioned, what he could also be saying is, guys, let's not be like all the other nations who embrace the Babylonian theology and culture and forsake their own origin. Let's remember that our God resides on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and nowhere else. And for Zion and Jerusalem, for the redemption of Zion. And Nebuchadnezzar came here in 586. He destroyed our city and our kingdom. He stole our Ark of the Covenant, which represents our connection to our God and Maker. And metaphorically speaking, we are the equivalent of dry bones, physically and spiritually. But guys, hang in there, and in 2 generations' time, the Babylonian Empire will be toppled by a Persian, and the Emperor series will allow Zerubbabel to return, and Azariah and Nehemiah to rebuild the house of God in the temple in Jerusalem, exactly like this prophecy talks about. And Christ, in one of his arguments with a set of the Jews which no longer exists, called the Sadducees, the argument is about the very existence of an afterlife, because the Sadducees is a set which exists in the New Testament era and yet subscribe to an Old Testament Jewish theology. Let's continue. Guys, it's pretty heavy duty, and usually I have a lot more than 1 hour to discuss all of this. Let's continue. Guys, before we continue, the difference between a burial cave in the Old Testament and a burial cave in the New Testament, like the one Christ was buried in the time of Christ, there's no communal shaft. Because of the Ezekiel 37 prophecy, everyone now gets their own little ostrary. Because if that physical resurrection prophecy is to be actually come to fruition, the people now don't want the bones to get confused with each other in that communal shaft. I'm not kidding. That is really the reason why the burying rituals of the Jewish people changed. Let's continue. Guys, the imagery on the left is the city of David as it exists today. And the image on the right is taken from the model at Jerusalem. And it describes how this place was during the ministry of Christ. Notice that during that time, it is a very, very, very upscale, gated community for Jews who attained the rank of royalty somewhere overseas. And yet, these Jews who attained royalty somewhere overseas also go to the temple once a year. But when they do it, they have their own palace in Jerusalem. And they live in a gated community. And the city of David is somewhere underneath, buried, and no one knows about it during the time of Christ. The fact that we can visit both the Old Testament and the New Testament relics in our day and age, it's an anachronism. They were never available for visitation in the same time. It's because archaeologists made it so and leveled it so the general public can go and visit. Let's continue. So the handsome gentleman on the left with the very impressive mustache is a man called Captain Charles Warren. He is a captain of engineers in the service of Her Majesty Queen Victoria. He is a member of the PEF, Palestine Exploration Fund, sent and commissioned by the Royal Society in London, England, in the late 19th century, 1870s to be exact, just a little bit after the American Civil War. The guy is a real archaeologist, or as close to it that existed in that time frame. And what the British government didn't advise the Turkish government, that each one of the scientists is also a commissioned officer in their armed forces. And they did very real and very serious scientific work, but they also tagged and tallied everything that was a military asset, which later paid off big time in World War I. A few decades down the line, the British already had all the information they needed for their takeover of the Middle East. Captain Warren was the first Western archaeologist in Jerusalem, hence Warren's Arch and Western Wall, the Struthion Pool underneath the Antonia Fortress. It's all his discoveries. He's the first real scientist to excavate. And he discovers the city of Jerusalem, or Old Testament Jerusalem, completely and utterly by accident. This is the first time that anyone realizes that old city and ancient city are completely and utterly different things. And this is why we have so many David monicures, because people came to Jerusalem for pilgrimage and they started attributing the name David to the so-called tomb, the so-called tower, the so-called citadel, etc. Fun fact, Captain Warren, who revolutionized archaeology, much later in his life is the commissioner of London police who fails to catch Jack the Ripper. And the guy should have stuck to archaeology and not indulge in law enforcement. Let's continue here. Guys, this is the inside of the city of David. I'm not kidding. I'm telling you this is a mandatory visit, but please be advised that for mobility, it's a little difficult. It's not for everyone. In this case, the infrastructure is 4,000 years old, and it's Jebusite. It means when King David took over the city of Jerusalem, he took over this infrastructure, which was already 1,000 years old when King David took it over 3,000 years ago. 4,000-year-old man-made cave. And what the Jebusite did, they took a natural crack between two layers of bedrock and capitalized on it over a very, very, very long period of time. Something Hezekiah certainly didn't have in 701 when he had to prepare the city for siege on a very, very limited time frame. Let's continue. Guys, this is the Gihon pool. This is where King Solomon gets coronated. It's 100% a positive ID. This would have been filled with water from roughly 4,000 years ago until 701 before Christ. and the new waterwork by Hezekiah took this pool out of commission. But when King Solomon get crowned in 970-ish plus before Christ, this was definitely filled with the water of the Gihon spring. And when we read the Bible over there, we can see 100% that the geographical descriptions of how things are located relative to each other in this time frame, it's a 100% exact match. Let's continue. The model illustrates the two waterworks, and I cannot explain to you exactly how Hezekiah did what he did over this medium. We will have to save that for the real deal when you're in town. But I want to point out that you can see two yellow lines. The lower one is the 4,000-year-old Canaanite Jebusite from 2000 before Christ. And the one which goes west, if you will, or upper and left in this image, is Hezekiah's work from 701 before Christ, which means this is a very, very, very rare case in the science of archaeology where lower is okay. In this case, the lower one is older, but there are other very rare cases where things got shuffled. In this particular case, though, yeah, let's continue. Let's continue. So, guys, the lower, okay. Now I can explain it properly. To the left side is the entrance to the 4,000-year-old cave. But in this case, when Hezekiah builds his tunnel, on purpose, he's excavating in 701 underneath the pre-existing Canaanite tunnel. Okay, Ophir, let's go backwards a little bit. Let's go one slide backwards. So in this case, the actual height of it is, the newer one will be taller in this angle. Let's go to the next one. Next. But the entrance is lower, means this will be a very rare case in archaeology where lower is actually younger, which means the dry Canaanite tunnel, this is the tunnel Job would use to enter the city through the water shaft. This is 4,000 years old. The lower one is a mere 2,700 or something like that, or 2,300. 2,700, which means the lower one is younger. Almost never happens. Guys, the mechanics of it, I need to explain in the field, which is going to be quite interesting on its own right. Let's continue. Guys, the tunnel is definitely not for everyone. This imagery is of the dry Canaanite tunnel, which is quite easy to accomplish. The walking in the 701 Hezekiah tunnel, it's to walk knee-deep in water of the Gihon spring till this very day in pitch blackness. One must bring his own flashlight, and it could be quite slippery. I don't recommend and advise it for necessarily every visit. Let's continue. The exit of it means there's a gathering pool for the Gihon spring. And there are two gathering pools of the Gihon spring. Let's look at both of them. And we'll see it in the next slide. Wonderful. This is the one created by Hezekiah in 701. This is the Old Testament. And the managers of the park over there made an executive decision, and they funnel the water into the Old Testament gathering pool. Let's see the next slide with the New Testament gathering pool. This is about half of it, only half of it was excavated. And notice immediately when we're in the New Testament period, notice how the stonemasonry is superior by far in its symmetrics and its architecture. You don't need to be a professional archaeologist to notice the difference, because we just leaped 1,000 years into the future. Bam, just like that. And this is the pool of Siloam, which is mentioned in the Gospel of St. John, where Christ orders a man who was born blind to wash his eyes. And the guy starts to see, and the whole thing makes a massive commotion. Now, this is at the very, very low end of the real Mount Zion, the city of David. And in this pool, the pilgrims from all over Judea and all over the world came in for the physical cleansing before ascending the pilgrimage stairway, which is currently being made ready for the public. It's a brand new project that will open, God willing, when this horrendous pandemic is over. When they climb all the way up the stairs in the New Testament era, they would arrive to the spiritual cleansing right there at the southern steps at the mikveh. But this pool, when Christ tells this individual to go wash his eyes over there, Christ knows full well this is the gathering pool that all of the pilgrims that are made their way to town now go to drink and clean themselves. He knows this will be the most public place possible. And I want to close this lecture with a statement that I started this conversation in the palace built by King David and the Old Testament. I finish this conversation in the Gospel of St. John and a healing of a man born blind. If I try to separate the Bible from its old and new components, I can never do my job as a biblical archaeologist in the city of Jerusalem. I must recognize both. It's impossible to do this otherwise. Okay. Ophir, let's see if there's anything else on the slideshow. I believe there is none. No, this is, you see that black tunnel over there? That leads to the Pilgrim Highway. The Pilgrim Highway today is, of course, underground, but during the pilgrimage of the New Testament era, of course, it was underneath the open sky. But 2,000 years of Jerusalem being rebuilt layer upon layer upon layer upon layer means we can now go on a 2,000-year-old stairway, but this is underneath and supporting the weight of the modern neighborhoods, which means this is one of the most expensive and most ambitious and difficult archaeological projects of all time anywhere. This is going to be an upcoming attraction for 2021, when, God willing, we'll go back to business as usual. And I believe this is it. We still have 15 minutes, so I'm happy to take any questions if we have them.
Thank you very much, Edan. And does anybody have any questions? You're welcome to voice them here. Let me see here. Somebody chatted a question. Let me see. No, that's not it. If anybody has a question, you're welcome to. Edan, I wanted to ask you a question while others are thinking about it.
Yes, sir.
I read an article or several articles about the very interesting point of view. There are some archaeologists who claim that there was never a King David. And there are some that
Wonderful
say that
question.
there was a King David. Could you, since we were talking about the city of David, could you maybe shed some light on this argument from both points of view? And I'd love to hear what you think about it.
So the Tel Aviv University Biblical Archaeology Department, which is led by Professor Israel Finkelstein, which is a brilliant and respectable man, they are less inclined to validate the Bible, if you will, the Tel Aviv University. The leaders in the Jerusalem University, that the current leader is Professor Eilat Mazar. My close personal friend, Dr. Shokrun, is actually the guy in charge of the city of David today. And one of my best friends and business partner, Danny the Digger, is in the Tel Aviv Jerusalem University faculty. So I am closer in my analysis to Jerusalem than I am to David. And remember I told you about the story of David and Bathsheba, David and Bathsheba, that I'm 100% sure that that story is true as it happened.
Wow.
Which story I'm not sure about? David and Goliath. I'm not sure about that story. Because I'm going to tell you a story, okay? And I'm going to tell you a story about a very dire situation. And the galaxy was really threatened by a super weapon that the forces of evil created. And then this kid shows up out of a farm out of nowhere. And via his connection to a supernatural force, he blew up the Death Star and became a prominent leader to this evil. Rings a bell? It's an archetypical story. It's a story that is designed to, punch buttons in our minds. 1 Samuel 17. Want to hear another story?
A quick one, sure.
The kingdom is divided, and there's not the right king in power. But luckily, the primary priest or prophet Merlin found the correct king and ordained him in secret. And in exactly the right moment, this guy shows up and pulls a sword out of the stone, validating his claim, and unites the tribes into one unified. Sounds familiar? Because it's an archetypical story which is designed on purpose to achieve certain things. And the people who codexed the Hebrew Bible are the followers of the house of David. So they have, and David did exist, okay? David existed, the house of David existed, but the people who committed this to pen were on the payroll of the house of David. And they have every intention in the world to make the patriarch of the house of David look the best that they possibly can. Which means when this guy screwed up so bad with Bathsheba, they didn't have a choice. Against their wishes, they had to include that as well. Because it was such a horrible screw up by this very real, very morally flawed person, David. Like all of us. Like all of us poor sinners.
So we have, thank you, Edan. So we have a question here from Lola. Lola, I think she's from Ohio, if I'm not mistaken. Wonderful, wonderful, beautiful person. And I've known her family for many, many years. And she's asking, why is the pool of Shiloach dry? of Shalom? Why is it dry?
There's two pools of Shiloach. Notice also when you read the Gospel of John, notice he says the pool of Siloam, which means to send. It's in the Gospel of John. Okay? But in the Gospel of John, no one is sending any water anywhere. All of this water is coming in from where Efrat is today by aqueducts, by Roman aqueducts. But even during the time the Gospel of John is written, the Hebrews still retain a collective memory of Hezekiah sending the water in 701 during the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem. And this is why this very specific terminology, to send, is still used in the Gospel of John. Shiloach, which means to send.
To send. Wow. And then we have, okay.
Now, the fact that the Old Testament pool is being used and the New Testament pool is not being used, it's an artificial thing that the guys who managed the park decided. It's not an archaeological decision. I think it's more of a marketing decision. Yes, sir.
Thank you. And then we have Joe from North Carolina. Hey, Joe. And he's asking about
Joe,
where
I'm going to come to lecture in North Carolina when this nuisance is over. And
just so everybody from North Carolina, knows that Edan is just dying to come to North Carolina. He's heard so much from me about the wonderful people there. He's just dying to come and meet everybody.
Hopefully you can organize something in Wisconsin as well. Yes, sir.
Yes, absolutely. So Joe is asking, where is the city of David in modern Jerusalem today? Imagine if everybody could imagine if they're standing on the Mount of Olives, we could take a look from there.
Remember the last week lecture, we did have a slide from the Mount of Olives. And you're looking at the eastern wall from the Mount of Olives. You clearly see the Sovereign Steps. And right underneath the Sovereign Steps, immediately south, is the city of David. Now, during the Old Testament period, the Palace of David would have been the second highest building in town. The only building that would be higher would be the house of God on the Temple Mount itself. Which means when King David is sitting out there on his flat rooftop, he can clearly see all of his subjects and what they're doing on their rooftops, which are lower than his rooftop. And that led to the unfortunate incident.
So you're okay. So I was just trying to get the picture of the old city on there. Let me see here. Okay, so Edan, thank you very much. I'm not able to find the picture from last time. I apologize to everybody. I was hoping to be able to find it. But in any event, Edan, thank you again for a absolutely fantastic and wonderful lecture today. And we will be seeing you soon in one of the future lectures. We have, oh, thanks, Joe and Glenette. And we have with us a guide by the name of Erez Cohen, who's going to be will be taking a little bit of a break from archaeology next week. And Erez is with us also, and he'll be talking about the diversity of Israeli society. Shalom, Erez. Do you want to introduce yourself for next week?
Hello, guys. My name is Erez. Not like Edan, I'm more in the current politics and current people of Israel. And the diversity, like in archaeology, where you have like a diversity of opinions. And a lot of the names of sites connected to different traditions. Edan mentioned that as an archaeologist, a biblical archaeologist, he has to take the Old Testament and the New Testament together. Any one of you here knows, for example, that the Quran is very connected to the Old Testament and the New Testament together. And giving that, you can see and understand that confusion in findings is even more difficult when you speak about the different people of Israel. Somebody has a question about what I just said.
So is that that's for next week? Yes.
Yeah, for next week we're going to speak about the diversity of the people of Israel.
The diversity of the people, and a lot of people don't know that Israel is an extremely diverse society from many different aspects. It's a very interesting story behind every group within the Israeli society, every group and subgroup, religions, ethnic, cultural.
I'll ask Edan. Edan, are you an Ashkenazi Jew or a Sephardi Jew?
I am 100% Ashkenaz.
Okay, which is a European Jew.
Correct. And my wife is half Dutch, half Persian, which means I am Eastern European, and my girls are Ashkenaz, Persian, and Dutch. We're not sure what they are anymore. They are Israeli.
So you're starting to understand? And this is without the fact of having 23andMe tests and stuff like this, which find different things about Palestinian people that discover that they're Jewish, and Jewish people that discover that they're not really Europeans. And this is like just giving you a taste of what we're going to speak about next week.
One big happy family.
Depends who you ask, but yes.
Thank you, Erez, very much. We're very much looking forward to seeing that next week. And of course, we'll continue. To be quite honest with you, we've got lectures going all the way through May from what I can see here, according to what we're planning. And now that we're done with Erez's introduction for next week, we have a very special guest here with us. We have Wafika from Cairo, Egypt. Shalom Wafika, salam alaikum, masai al-khir ya habibti.
Alaikum assalam, masai al-nur, Ophir, Edan, ladies and gentlemen. Hello everybody. As Ophir introduced me, my name is Wafika Boraya. I'm a tour guide from Cairo, Egypt. And I had the pleasure to work with Ophir and the beautiful group from Scopia Tours a few months ago. And he has arranged for me to give some lectures on ancient Egypt. We can do that on modern Egypt as well. Every day, every lecture will be addressing a certain topic in order to permit you to give you an idea about different aspects of the Egyptian history, civilization, looking forward, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you, Ophir.
Thank you very much, Wafika. How are things in Cairo otherwise in all of this? You know, we're everybody on this meeting right now is in the U.S. except for Edan and Erez, who are in Israel. But how are things in Egypt as far as how people are feeling, you know, things like that?
I have to say, with the government and everybody, I mean, all the media are trying to keep everything under control with a big population, and we're not people used to really staying home. So now there's a curfew from starting 7 p.m. You can go out starting 6 a.m. till 7 p.m. But there are words saying that very soon it's going to be totally banned, so you have to stay home. Especially, we expect that the virus is going to start getting vicious for a week from today. So we hope for the best. But right now, I mean, everybody's saying you should stay home, but still there are lots of people on the streets going to their jobs. Of course, all the schools and universities are closed for now. Everybody's working from home. What can I tell you, Ophir? A lot of efforts are really made by the government, you know, on the medical side. Cars, ambulance cars sent to people to assess whether they're ill or not as soon as they give them a call. There are a lot of quarantines arranged everywhere. The airport is closed for now, and if you want to come into Egypt, you're going to go to Marsa Alam Way in the south on the Red Sea and be quarantined for 14 days, which is not a bad idea at all. So we hope for the best all over the world.
Absolutely, for each and every person and country around the world. I hope that this ends well, everybody healthy, and thank you very much, Wafika. We're looking forward to learning about Egypt. I'm wondering, is your friend the guide Soha with us as well? Is she here also, I wonder? I don't know.
I'm not sure she is, but we'll be arranging, she and me, both of us will be arranging for those lectures. She's a very good guide, and I'm sure she also has lots of things to tell you about ancient Egypt.
Absolutely. And I can say, from, I traveled to Egypt twice already, once on my own and once with a group. And people cannot imagine the magnitude of what was built until they see it with their own eyes.
That's true.
A picture is not worth 1,000 words in Egypt, because your own eyesight is worth 1,000 pictures.
Yes,
It's just
being there.
unbelievable, the magnitude and the beauty of Egyptian architecture from ancient Egypt, and the temples and everything. So we're very much looking forward to that, Wafika. Thank you.
Same here, Ophir. And I'm sure by the end of those lectures that we'll be giving, Suha and I, everybody would want to come, and we would love to receive you with all of them, inshallah, very soon as things get under control.
Inshallah. Thank you very much, Wafika.
You're most welcome.
guys,
Stay safe.
Yeah, somebody was saying something?
Guys, just want to say something. In Israel, for example, about the virus, we're going to have Easter, Passover, and Ramadan coming one after another, which is making the situation in Israel, controlling the virus. It's going to be a very, very intense week in all the Middle East and in Israel.
That's because all the families get together during the holidays.
Yes,
and,
during Ramadan and then Easter, and then, which is everything happens in the same city, Jerusalem.
Wow. Jerusalem, yeah. A very interesting and challenging situation.
Yes.
Okay, so very good. So, yeah, Wafika?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Edan for a very interesting and informative lecture. Thank you, Edan.
Yeah, I think Edan left, if I'm not mistaken. I don't see him anymore. It could be that he left. Maybe one of his girls was calling him or something, but I'll be sure it's on the recording. I'll make sure that he sees it. So wonderful. Thank you again to everybody. Thank you, Ashley, for your prayer. We'll see you again next week. And just as a little something of order of business, if you could send me your emails, that you'd like to register, if you could send them until at least at the latest, let's say 10 a.m. Eastern time, Central time, doesn't really matter, on Saturday. That way I can make sure everybody has the links and everything. Otherwise, if I get those emails during the conversation itself, it makes things a little bit challenging here for me to send emails while I'm talking to people. So for all those who want to join, you can send an email until 10 a.m. every Saturday. Let's make that a deal between us. Thank you again, everybody. Shabbat shalom to those of us in the U.S. Shavua tov in Jerusalem and in Cairo. And we'll see you again next week. I really appreciate you being here with us. Stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.